Welcome to the Blind Zone, where curiosity brings its own rewards. And so I'm just super thrilled because I have a return guest today. His name is Phil, and he's my neighbor, and he's going to be talking about jazz. So welcome, Phil. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back. I like your phrase where curiosity does include us to look around at different things we see in our life. So I totally agree.
Yeah, because I am a very curious person, and my brother and my son would say I'm just nosy, but I like curiosity better because it makes me seem a little more palatable. But today we're going to be talking about jazz because you told me that you are a jazz aficionado, and so I have a number of questions because I don't know that much about jazz. When I first got here, a guy said, "Oh, let me take you to this jazz club that was close," and so we went, and I left, and I thought, yeah, I don't still know enough about it to like it one way or the other. So I have some questions. Are you ready?
I'll do the best I can.
Well, I know you have a long history with understanding and appreciating jazz. So, but where did jazz actually start? Is there a starting point that anybody can pinpoint?
Well, there is, and it's been debated or it's been discussed for years. Jazz is a mixture of things, of both sounds and cultures, and that continues today. It started that way actually in New Orleans, Louisiana, and one of the reasons it started there is because of the mixture of cultures in the city, primarily Black, Cajun, Creole, French, a little Spanish, the influence of opera, the influence of strong churches with their own style of music, and a city that was wide open to things, some good, some bad. And it made it easy, or I shouldn't say easy, it made it conducive for something like jazz to start there. It started, as best we know, about the turn of the century, the last century, about 1890, 1915. Or 1859, 69, excuse me. But we really got going about the turn of the century with a player by the name of Buddy Bolden. And Buddy Bolden was at one time a mythical character, but it was later proved that no, he was a real trumpet player, African American. And unfortunately, he was never recorded because the history of jazz, as we study it today, is based on recordings. In other words, what I've listened to, besides all the live music I've heard, is basically some type of recordings. The first jazz recording was done in 1917 in New Orleans by white musicians, which was a little injustice from day one, but that's the way it started. And then it spread. But New Orleans was the basis of it. Now, New Orleans, or jazz in New Orleans, is played differently than it is, say, in Kansas City or in St. Louis or Chicago. If you think about jazz, it's sort of like those bus tours you could get on and get off. In other words, you don't have to stop in one particular area of jazz, nor do you have to listen to each one of those. The beauty of jazz is kind of like going to an art museum. You can look at some of the pictures and say, well, I guess that's fine, but to me, that's a lot of spots on a piece of paper. Or, boy, that impressionistic art is just my style. There's no, you have to. You can follow it and listen to it on a number of levels. I tend to listen to most of it, but my listening to jazz history goes back almost 80 years for me because my mother and father were jazz listeners, and we had record players. They were 78s in those days. So I literally grew up with it. And then my mother and I used to listen on the radio. Remember radios?
I'm not that old, so. But yes, I do remember.
And we would listen to the live broadcast from the ballrooms in Chicago because we lived 100 miles from Chicago. And my mother had a little radio, and my father worked nights and all day. So it was my mother and I, as a young man, she would dial in very carefully to get the station. So I go back that far. And the things I say, remember, are my opinion. They're not locked in stone. And nothing about jazz which is what makes it interesting, is locked in stone.
That was one thing that I noticed, that everybody had a different style. They
Yeah.
all put their own spin on it.
Yep.
Now, I have to go back. So when you were talking about the 1800s, what kind of instruments were around there that would have been replicated for jazz or would have been used to play jazz?
Well, the interesting thing about jazz is you'll find almost every instrument that you and I are aware of in jazz. In the early days, it was based primarily on the brass, uh, trumpet, trombone, augmented by a clarinet, and then some kind of rhythm. In the early days, it was a banjo. That went
Hmm.
away. The banjo sort of left the scene, replaced by, quite frankly, guitar. There are no instruments on which you do not or cannot play jazz. Example, one of my favorite new artists, and she is relatively new, she has a very, very large orchestra, concert type orchestra. And she is a young woman, and one of her instruments that's in her large orchestra is an accordion. Now, that's not something except in some very special things. A lot of jazz and a lot of jazz pioneers played the organ, the big organ, like a church organ, not like a little modern one, but literally like a church organ. Fats Waller, who you're probably familiar with because he wrote a song, uh, Embraceable You and Honeysuckle Rose,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
played a lot on a church organ. Some of those organs were in movie theaters that they played along with the silent movies. Violin, Stefan Grappelli, a violinist who, up until a few short years ago, was alive, played in France in the 30s and 40s, and in this country in the 60s and 70s. So there really isn't any limitation. There's sort of a what you want the voicing to sound like. In other words, if you look at a big band, the classic big band out of the 30s and 40s and early 50s,
Mm-hmm.
four saxophones, two trombones, three trumpets, rhythm, guitar, piano.
Mm-hmm.
But there really isn't anything that you cannot play jazz on or isn't used someplace in jazz at some time.
Because, my sister plays the harp, and I
Oh
thought,
yeah,
I can't even imagine the harp
uh,
in
I,
jazz.
I can think of a couple of incidents, but it's a rarity.
Because it isn't, okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I'm learning this all new. Because when I think of jazz, I think of, the trumpet, the saxophone, the clarinet,
Mm-hmm.
those kind of instruments that have the brassy, the thing you can stretch out, the piano where you
Mm-hmm.
can, just do all kinds of things. But when you mention the accordion, my mind jumps back to, the polka days when my son and I would just, poke around in our kitchen, with some accordion player, and, we would laugh at that. But I guess it's what you make that instrument do, because jazz, this is how I internalize jazz. Jazz, I think, is an emotional uh, explanation to other people that you can evoke through sound, a story that is told through your instruments.
Excellent, it is, and it's carried on by vocalists who sing like a horn. Is the best way I can, or
Mm-hmm.
phrase like a horn, or the reverse. Uh, the person playing the horn adds a voice to it, almost a voice sounding to it, and there's some crossover in that. The limitation is not so much with the instruments. To your point, it's with the musicians themselves.
Right, the talent within them to
Yep.
to drag that out.
It,
Because when I was thinking of just genres, I was thinking of rock and blues and uh, just different segments, folk and other segments. And jazz, I think, has the widest repertoire of possibilities because it's really personality driven. Because even when I was at that jazz nightclub, it was like everybody could get up and show their talents, and it was like a talent night too, besides the regular band. And they all had their own spin on it. But when they sat down collectively, even though they didn't know each other, they were confident enough with their own skills that they just blended it in seamlessly, but they still told a very distinct story.
And it's the musicians communicating with each other and with the audience. The history of jazz for many, many years was meant to be danced to. In other words, even in the very early days in New Orleans, it was designed to dance to. That didn't change dramatically until the 50s or the 40s when bop came in, and that's a listening music. But there were signs that there were changes. In 1938, for instance, Benny Goodman took his orchestra and a lot of other additional musicians into Carnegie Hall. And you obviously sat and listened. Duke Ellington, that I repeated that in 43. He took his orchestra into Carnegie Hall. And nowadays, the large bands are primarily what I would call concert situations. In other words, you go to hear them in an auditorium, or their records or their vinyls would be presented as a suite or as a concerto, depending on your termination. But once again, back to my analogy of an art museum. When you go in the art museum, you can say, well, you know, that 13th century stuff, I'm not into that. On the other hand, those Impressionist paintings, boy, that's got my thing. Jazz is like that, as, by the way, is most music. I listen to classical music. Don't let that get out, by the way. I listen to classical music, and I pick and choose that also. I don't particularly care for some of the early Bach, although I recognize the history of it, and I will listen to it. But I like Stravinsky as a thing. So it's and jazz is really no different. You're drawn to one thing, or the other track that a lot of people have taken or take on occasion is they like specific instruments. In other words, they may spend a whole day listening to jazz guitar from its beginning in the jazz idiom to the stuff that's being done today. Or they may like trumpet players. So they'll go back to Armstrong and end up with the latest and greatest on the thing. And that's their limitation. Nobody will give you a bad mark listening to jazz if you say, man, I'm not listening to anything that was recorded after 1935. As a guy who does a lot of listings, I say, hey, you really need to expand. You don't have to love it, but at least expand your listening to it and then decide. Or you can say, hey, I'm not anything beyond Bix Beiderbecke, I'm not interested in.
Well, because when you mentioned dancing with jazz, I was like, until you said that, I wouldn't have even imagined that. Because again, when we're all sitting there, we're just listening to it, and I might have been tapping my toes, but I wouldn't have been, because it's not, and I guess if these are songs that they played over and over, where you know what's coming next. With jazz, it seems so fluid and
right,
in movement that I wouldn't have been able to dance along to it. And you know, and I do like, well, I have to tell you my classical story. My friend and I, my best friend Janine, we went to see Beethoven at midnight, or it was called, I don't know who it was, but anyway, so we went, and we had worked all week and we were tired. It was a Friday. We were sitting in the front row, and they started to play that classical sleepy music, and we both fell asleep. They woke us up when the thing was over, but that's kind of our funny story, because we like classical. We just don't want to listen to it at midnight on a Friday after we worked all week. But the jazz thing and dancing, like, I never would have really thought of that.
Sure, because it was designed, or it was born in New Orleans to dance to. And when the big bands came on, they played in ballrooms. They played in places where you could dance. The big bands of the 30s and 40s would not have survived without ballrooms where you could go with your date or your wife, your husband, and dance. And good band directors, good band leaders would look out over the floor and see what people were dancing to and adjust their sound or the selection of music to that crowd that was dancing. A lot of old people trying to waltz, so you'd play a waltz. A lot of jitterbuggers. One of the famous jazz halls in New York used to be the old Savoy Ballroom, and it was called Where Happy Feet Meet, meaning, and the big bands all played there. Ella Fitzgerald started singing there as in a career. When it came to bebop, or bop as it's called, that was a music designed strictly to listen to, or it is strictly to listen to. There isn't a steady dance type beat to it. To your point, it wouldn't be something that you'd have to be a highly trained ballerina, or but you and I wouldn't get up and jitterbug to it, or dance to it. Jazz left New Orleans and migrated north for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Great Migration, which I'm sure you studied about, of African Americans, affected jazz. The jazz musicians said, "Hey, I can make more money in Chicago than I can make here in New Orleans," and the U.S. Navy got involved because they closed Storyville, and Storyville was a district in New Orleans for brothels, bars, so forth. And the Navy said, "Oh, we can't have this anymore." And there was less places to work. It was simple as that. It was an economy thing.
Mm-hmm.
Each of the cities that jazz moved to added its own style for a variety of reasons. Kansas City has its own style of jazz even to this day. Chicago, once again, Louis Armstrong moved from New Orleans to Chicago and changed jazz by putting more solos into it, having more, quite frankly, more talent, and jazz was never the same. More solos. When it moved to New York, it picked up its own additions to it. Those additions, or those moods, I guess, still exist today. Like a lot of things that happen in history, the lines are a little blurred now. It isn't quite so definite, but it's there. You can tell it. Particularly from New Orleans to Chicago was a big change, and then Chicago to New York was a larger change. Even those sounds still exist today in those cities.
Well, and I would have to believe that Louisiana, since it was the starting point, that it was just very dense with these different musicians, and that when some of them went off, the people who were left could then have more room to do their craft, and even they then, I'm sure, retained some change in what they did, as opposed to the people who went off to Chicago and New York,
very definitely,
and Kansas City. So again, it's like any group of people. If you're all densely packed together and half of you leave, the half of you that stay spread out and do what they now are able to do because there's less people to challenge them.
And two things, yeah, you're right. And two things impacted. Number one, the radio, and number two, obviously, recordings that people could afford to buy. The wind-up Victrola came in, 78 records. You didn't have to be wealthy to buy a crank-up Victrola and buy a couple of new 78s when they came out. Even if you didn't have any musical skill, or you couldn't afford a piano in the house, and that was and the radio had jazz on it. So if you had a radio dialed around, you could find somebody broadcasting it, and you still can today, by the way.
So what would be your I don't know, hard sell for somebody to give jazz a thoughtful listen? Because again, there's certain kinds of music that, I mean, I laugh at country music, but people, there are a lot of people who love that, and there are heavy metal groups I don't care for, but there's some rock bands I do like, and certain styles like folksy kind of stuff, not really into that. So what would be the biggest selling point you can say about jazz that would make people want to stop and give it another listen if they have not been in tune to it like you were for your whole life? I was going to say indoctrinated, but that's not the right word either, because you were just submerged in it and then you grew to love it because of that.
I would say, to, like anything, to tiptoe into it. In other words, and you only maybe want to tiptoe in it. It's not necessary to. You may say, I went to a concert and I heard this fantastic classical guitar player. I wonder if those kind of guys play jazz. And yes, to answer your question, yes, they do, and yes, they're out there. So maybe you go to the library and you find a CD or a record by Lorenzo Almeida or Jim Hall. Come home and listen to it, and you go, "Hey, I really like to listen to it. It's quiet, it's relaxing, it's good music to read by. It's interesting. I have to listen to it because I can either just kind of let it pass over my head, or I can very consciously say, now, what is that? I recognize that song, but then after the first 12 bars, what is he doing on that guitar?
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes you plunge right into it and say, I heard a guy talking about Dave Brubeck. What is that all about? Well, one way to find out, go rent a record at the library or borrow one from somebody, listen to it, and you go, I don't think so. Or, hey, that's neat. Piano, a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of jazz is played on a piano, and a lot of different styles. There's what we used to call stride piano, which came out of Harlem in the 30s. Very strong left hand. People like Fats Waller,
Mm-hmm.
or there's very quieter. Bill Evans is a pianist that comes to mind, where you can sit and listen to it, and it's heavy. By that I mean there's a lot to it. It's not simple. He starts out with 12 bars of melody, and then he's off to his own things he has to say. You don't have to jump all the way in, and you don't need to. Some people say, well, I would never listen to Dixieland. My goodness gracious, that's not a bunch of loud noises. On the other hand, somebody just turned on the modern jazz quartet. Never heard of them until I heard that.
Mm-hmm.
Almost a French string quartet type of atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who likes classical string quartets would listen to the modern jazz quartet and say, hey, that's pleasing to me. I can accept it. So you kind of go that way. Because of my impact on it, I do listen to. I set my music up in the day by the mood that I'm in for that day. Sometimes my mood and my wife's mood don't match, so I have to be careful to make sure that she will say put something on quiet so I can read, and when I'm by myself or she's in the right mood, I will put on some pretty heavyweight, particularly the new orchestrations of people I like. Um, so it's like any art form. Do I like all modern sculptures? Maybe some, maybe not. Do I like all the old stuff? It's okay, I guess. It's an emotional music. All music is, but jazz is a very emotional music. That means it's got to fit with your emotion at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday or 9 o'clock on a Friday night.
Well, because again, for me, jazz has always more been about the storytelling and the musician's ability to translate that story into an emotion you'll resonate with.
That's absolutely correct.
And because that's why people like the old country music, because it tells a story and it'll evoke an emotion with you, but they're using words to tell you the story. But in a lot of instances in jazz, they're using a variety of instruments to like you said, on the days that your wife wants quiet in the house, you do quieter things with your music. But on days that you want to feel a little more emotion, then you go to that end of the spectrum. And so I think that's the beauty part of jazz.
It is.
It's the emotional connection that you make with a series of instruments, because you can read the title and whatever that title is, and that'll evoke in you it'll pop in your head what you think it ought to mean. And then when the music starts to play, you fit in well with it, or you revise what you thought they were talking about, but it still tells a story.
It still tells a story. And of course, you can't, in jazz, like any music, you cannot overlook the vocalists. because they tell the story obviously in a different way, and there's a whole once again a whole pyramid. You can start with Bessie Smith in the 20s and listen to blues, straight blues.
Mm-hmm.
You can end up with uh, the great vocalist Holiday, Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, and then the next level down. Uh, and there's some good ones out there. You can listen to Tony Bennett, which we, of course, just lost, and probably one of the primary jazz vocalists, certainly of the last 40 or 50 years, along with Mr. Sinatra, of course. So,
Would you, well, okay, now I would not consider Frank Sinatra a jazz singer. I would consider him a strong singer, but so it depends on if you couple what he's singing with the instruments that are accompanying him.
well, no, you couple it with his phrasing. He was his phrasing is what made him a jazz quote unquote singer. You could listen to somebody that sang very straight and then listen to the same song by Sinatra and realizing he's changing the rhythm pattern just enough. He's sliding it left or right of the beat just enough. Not as
Okay.
much as Tony Bennett did,
Mm-hmm,
or say
mm-hmm.
a classical jazz singer like Jack Teagarden does or did, but just enough. And that's when jazz, he helped a lot cross jazz over into the popular mode. When it's said and done, besides being, as he called himself, a saloon singer, he was also, he cut a lot of records with the Count Basie Band as backup. And believe me, you're singing in front of the Basie Band. You're a jazz singer,
You're a jazz singer
whether
then,
you want to
yeah,
be or
yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, uh,
Well, that'll help me because that'll really help me interpret music differently when I'm listening to it, and I'm not just going to be able to plunk them all into one category
oh
because
no,
now he's going to be cross-cultured because he's singing similar songs,
that's
but
right.
in a different way to stretch them from one point to the
The
next.
other thing about jazz, there's a whole series, or not a series, a list, a book, as a matter of fact, of things called jazz standards. In other words, particular songs that are considered standards in the jazz idiom. Many of those are also just what we used to call popular music. And the interesting part about it, and I'll take one song, a trumpet player in the 30s, happened to be from Wisconsin, by the way, I slide that in, by the name of Benny Berrigan, uh, made a song extremely popular called I Can't Get Started. And you can tell the age because when you listen to the lyrics, it says, I flew around the world in a plane and I'd settled revolutions in Spain. So that'll give you a history. That song is still played today and still sung today, mostly played today by all different types of jazz musicians. And there are many, many songs like that. There are songs that are very much influenced by the church. A hymn that my church sings occasionally is Closer Walk with Thee. And that is a jazz standard. If you're going to play in a traditional jazz band, you better know how to play Closer Walk because somebody's going to call it. My history of playing music was limited. I played in a band that was a dance band with a little jazz because we played for dances. And we played a little jazz because we wanted to. One of the musicians, not me, was very good at it, and he's still playing at 85. And he plays very, very traditional trumpet, very, very good. And there are songs that are played were themes in music, or in movies, excuse me, that became jazz standards. And some of the standards, popular standards, Stardust, also played by jazz musicians, as well as what we call sweet. So it's all over the ballpark.
Well, because I know my son started playing piano at the age of 4, and he was very good. He could read music, and his first music teacher said, "Oh, we don't really teach 4-year-olds," and he did very, very well. And then when he got into middle school, he wanted to play the saxophone, so I bought him a saxophone, and he did very well with that. But he didn't have the stick-to-itiveness to say, "Oh, I want to continue to do this." But In fact, I still have a saxophone in my garage, but I refuse to give
What is
that
an
up.
alto or tenor? Does the
Uh,
neck go like this, or does it go up
oh,
like that?
yeah, you're asking details.
Okay.
That was a million years ago. I don't know, but again, I always, even when their band at school played, you could really, sense the jazzy theme that they
Yeah.
were, invoking because of all the instruments that they had. So, as we wrap this up, is there any final words you want to give us on
No,
the
nothing.
impromptu jazz concert?
Like almost anything. Uh, find something that you like, or find something that you don't care for. Take it the negative way. Like you've always said, keep an open mind. You're here to learn. You're here to experience. Uh, Nobody's going to take away your gold stars if you say, I tried it and I don't like it. This is America. We can listen to anything we want to. Uh,
Yeah, that's true.
uh, Remember what your folks or your grandparents were listening to.
Mm-hmm.
That may jar your memory.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's an art form. It's an art form. The classic comment made by a musician: "If you have to ask, don't bother."
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, just the amount of talent necessary
Oh,
to do that well. It clearly sifts out the hacks from the jewels. Hmm. Well, Phil, this has been fabulous fun, and
thank you again.
I really you've answered a lot of things for me, and I wouldn't have known had I not asked, and you answered them, and that's been great fun. And then, anyway, that's what curiosity does for you. It brings about some good results, and that's what we had today. Anyway, thank you. So we'll see you next week on the Blind Zone.